4:43 a.m. Tampa Bay, Florida. June 5, 2026. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Decisive had been running a standard maritime patrol near the bay entrance when the order came through from Sector St. Petersburg. Divert and conduct a safety inspection on a 52-foot hand-sea cutter returning from a reported training cruise to the Bahamas. The vessel's name was Crescent Wind. Owner Sapphire Sails Academy LLC record clean. Google rating 4.8 stars. The boarding party leader, Petty Officer First Class Aaron Torres, had conducted over 300 maritime inspections in 8 years with the Coast Guard. He would later tell federal investigators that nothing about the Crescent Wind looked wrong. Until it did. 22 minutes into the inspection, one of his crew members noticed that the keel cavity, the deepest structural compartment of the hull, had been modified. The access panel was newer than the surrounding woodwork by at least 5 years. The screws were a different grade of stainless. The panel edges showed no saltwater oxidation, which was inconsistent with the age of the vessel's hull certificate. Torres called his sector supervisor. His supervisor called NCIS Duty Watch. What the Coast Guard found inside that cavity triggered a federal indictment and shut down a 19-month narcotics pipeline between Holguín, Province, Cuba, and the Tampa Bay metropolitan area. It forced a classified congressional briefing on Caribbean interdiction failures within 72 hours. Inside the Keel, a 6-meter low-profile semi-submersible, partially disassembled and packed against the interior hull structure. 1,412 kilograms of cocaine. 43 GPS waypoints on a handheld unit, handwritten coordinates tracing a route from open Gulf water to a location in eastern Cuba. 2 satellite phones. $37,000 in U.S. currency, and a second set of fabrication blueprints rolled in waterproof tubing for a vessel no one had yet identified. 3 people would be in federal custody before sunrise. The school's owner, its senior instructor, and through a cooperation agreement signed 6 weeks before the raid, the owner himself would explain in detail how all of it worked and how long it had been working. This is the operational history of a narcotics pipeline that ran openly for 19 months. It hid behind a 4.8-star Google rating, American Sailing Association certifications, and weekly charters to the Florida Keys. Retention point, a 30-hook resolution tease. Sapphire Sails Academy had occupied its section of Davis Island's marina since 2014. 23 vessels, a classroom building with attached offices, a commercial pier with waterside access, and a storage facility for the school's equipment and maintenance supplies. The school offered American Sailing Association certifications from basic keelboat through offshore passage making. It ran corporate team-building charters for regional business clients. It catered to snowbirds from Michigan and Ohio who wanted to convert a recreational interest into something more structured. For offshore qualification, Sapphire offered Bahamas certification weekends, 72-hour passages from Tampa Bay to Nassau and back, logging enough blue water hours to satisfy ASA offshore requirements. The school had 212 enrolled students at any given time. Its instructors were well-reviewed and professionally regarded. Its owner, Marcus Delaney, had a 22-year maritime career, a merchant marine background, and no record in any federal or state criminal database. Nothing about any of this was unusual. That was the point. The story of how Sapphire Sails became the American staging end of a Cuban narcotics pipeline doesn't start at the marina. It starts in Washington, D.C., in November 2025, with an NCIS counter-narcotics analyst named Raymond Okafor and a question no one had asked him to investigate. He was looking at fuel. November 2025. Naval Criminal Investigative Service, Counter-Narcotics Analysis Division, Washington, D.C. Throughout the fall of 2025, the Pentagon's Caribbean posture shifted. Cuban naval exercises along the northern coastline increased in frequency and scale. Intelligence assessments of Venezuelan-Cuban resupply cooperation were being upgraded. And 3 separate internal DoD reviews identified what senior military planners called a coverage gap. A 120-mile corridor between Cuban territorial waters and the Florida Straits where maritime surveillance was inconsistent, coverage windows irregular, and small vessels had historically moved with limited detection risk. The coverage gap wasn't new, but Pentagon attention on Cuba was intensifying for reasons beyond narcotics. Force posture assessments, electromagnetic monitoring from Cuban military installations, and a classified assessment of Cuba's role in third-country resupply networks. Narcotics interdiction, for once, was getting analytical bandwidth that it didn't usually receive. NCIS was tasked with a broad data review. Pull anomaly reports on small charter operators in Gulf Coast ports. Look for behavioral patterns inconsistent with legitimate maritime business. Raymond Okafor had been doing this kind of work for 11 years. He was not looking for Sapphire Sails specifically. He was looking for numbers that didn't fit. He found one on November 17th. A 52-foot Hans cutter registered to Sapphire Sails Academy LLC had filed 9 crossing reports over the preceding 6 months, each documenting a training cruise to Nassau, Bahamas and return. The route, round trip, totaled approximately 900 nautical miles. Standard fuel consumption for the vessel class at standard cruising speed, roughly 6 knots under auxiliary diesel, was approximately 280 liters per round trip. Crescent wind had filed for fuel loads averaging 394 liters per crossing, 41% above threshold, every single time. No variation. No weather explanation logged. No cargo deviation noted. A vessel burning 40% more fuel than the route justifies is doing one of 2 things: running at higher speed than the filed itinerary would require, or carrying significantly more weight than the passenger and crew manifest reflects. Neither explanation was consistent with a sailing school training cruise to Nassau. Okafor flagged it. His supervisor logged it. The flag went into a queue alongside 17 other active analytical assessments. There was no specific named target, no existing case file to attach it to, no legal basis for active surveillance on fuel anomaly data alone. For 3 weeks, the flag sat. Then, on December 3, 2025, a Coast Guard patrol operating in the Florida Straits recovered a partially inflated dive buoy drifting approximately 40 nautical miles northeast of Havana. Attached to the buoy with waterproof cable ties, a sealed dry bag. Inside, a handheld GPS unit, a prepaid cellular module, and a handwritten printout of 4 maritime waypoints in Spanish. The GPS had been factory reset. The cellular module contained one text message, a string of numbers that didn't immediately resolve to standard coordinate notation. It was flagged, packaged, and forwarded to the Defense Intelligence Agency for analysis. 11 days passed. When a DEA analyst finally ran the number string, the coordinates resolved to a location in the open Gulf of Mexico, approximately 22 nautical miles northwest of Havana, equidistant between Cuban territorial waters and the established northeastward shipping lanes running toward Tampa, a mid-Gulf rendezvous point. No one connected it to Sapphire Sails that day. The buoy was logged as a potentially significant tactical data point, filed pending further context, and left waiting for something to connect it to. That something arrived 6 weeks later when NCIS Supervisor Karen Whitfield in Tampa pulled a consolidated Caribbean anomaly brief and noticed that both items had been compiled into the same document: Okafor's fuel anomaly report and the DI's buoy coordinate analysis. She made a phone call to Coast Guard District 7, January 8, 2026. Coast Guard Sector St. Petersburg, Tampa, Florida. The joint planning session lasted 4.5 hours. By the end, 3 agencies had reached operational alignment. Coast Guard would provide maritime tracking on crescent wind through existing patrol assets and supplemental aerial coverage from the P-8, Poseidon Maritime Patrol Aircraft Unit out of Jacksonville. NCIS would hold the analytical lead and maintain coordination with DEA on the Cuba side intelligence picture. DEA South Florida would integrate its parallel investigation, a separate assessment that had been running since the spring of 2025, tracking an unusual cocaine signature emerging in Tampa Bay area markets. DEA had a different data set. Their concern wasn't fuel loads. It was chemistry. Since March 2025, cocaine seizures in Hillsborough, Pinellas, and Manatee counties had been returning a consistent alkaloid signature that DEA's laboratory analysis unit traced to a specific processing region in western Cuba. The signature was chemically distinctive enough that the lab assigned it an internal designator. They called it Marker 17. Marker 17 cocaine had been appearing in increasing volume. Seizure quantities up, purity up, street availability up across multiple distribution points in the Tampa-St. Petersburg corridor. The distribution network, built from buy-bust operations and informant reporting, ran through a loose confederation of mid-level suppliers who shared one operational characteristic. All of them received product in small batches, carefully kept below federal mandatory minimum thresholds, from intermediaries they couldn't identify by name or face. No one was catching the source, just downstream evidence, purity spikes in street product, hospital overdose data trending upward in West Hillsborough County, buy-bust yields suggesting volume without corresponding source interdiction. When DEA South Florida shared the Marker 17 analysis with the NCIS Coast Guard Working Group in January, the operational picture clarified. Cuban-origin cocaine arriving through a vector that wasn't triggering maritime surveillance, distributed through a domestic network deliberately sized below federal enforcement thresholds. The fuel anomaly data pointed to a specific charter operator. The Marker 17 data pointed to a specific origin region. The buoy recovery pointed to a mid-Gulf rendezvous methodology. 3 separate data sets. 1 operational picture. The surveillance warrant package was approved by a federal magistrate in the Middle District of Florida on January 15, 2026. January 21, 2026. Davis Islands Marina, Tampa, Florida. NCIS deployed 2 undercover maritime units. The first established a cover identity as recreational live-aboard boaters. 2 agents aboard a 38-foot cruising sailboat named Compass Rose, flying a Georgia Yacht Club Burgee, berthed in Davis Islands Marina as winter seasonal tenants. Their cover documentation, backstopped through the Florida Boater Registration System, had been prepared in advance. They established a visible presence over the first week, visiting the marina office, nodding to dock neighbors, confirming berth payment in person, before transitioning to observation. The second unit operated from a center console fishing boat anchored in the bay, rotating position on a 2-day cycle to avoid establishing a surveillance pattern that a counter-surveillance-aware subject might detect. DEA contributed 2 ground surveillance operators who established fixed observation positions near the marina's commercial vehicle entrance. 1 operator worked from a service van logged as a marine electrical contractor in the marina's vendor records. The second rotated through 3 parking positions on adjacent residential streets, logging vehicle traffic and photographing every individual who accessed the Sapphire Sails boat storage facility. Coast Guard aerial assets provided intermittent overflights, scheduled to align with existing maritime patrol logs already filed with FAA. This procedural step prevented the increased aerial activity from appearing anomalous in publicly accessible flight records. Over the first 3 weeks of active surveillance, investigators documented 104 individuals accessing the Sapphire Sails facility. 91 confirmed as enrolled students through cross-reference with the school's public class schedule, marina dock log, and motor vehicle database cross-check on observed vehicles. 16 remained unaccounted for. 3 of the 16 emerged as priority subjects. Marcus Delaney, 51 years old, registered owner of Sapphire Sails Academy LLC and the Crescent Wind. Former merchant marine, 22 years as a licensed captain. A clean federal and state record going back to his first maritime certification in 2003. His public profile was in every verifiable dimension unremarkable. Carla Reinhold, 44, senior instructor, 14 years at Sapphire Sails. Dual citizenship, Danish and American. Maritime certifications issued by authorities in the United States, Denmark, and the Cayman Islands. Background consistent with a career maritime professional who had settled into a stable position in recreational sailing instruction. And then there was Subject 11, Subject 11 appeared on surveillance footage 11 times in the first 3 weeks of observation. He arrived by personal watercraft, a Sea-Doo, always dark-hulled, approaching from the water side of the marina between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. He spent between 20 and 40 minutes aboard Crescent Wind each visit and departed the way he came. He was never observed speaking with Delaney or Reinhold. He used Crescent Wind's waterside access hatch, which bypassed the dockside entry that the marina's security cameras covered. He moved with practiced efficiency. Aboard, task completed, gone. He left no visible trace. I spent time going through the surveillance logs on this phase of the investigation, and one detail kept coming back. Subject 11 never arrived more than 3 days before a scheduled filing for a Bahamas training cruise. The timing was never coincidental. He was performing a pre-transfer check. Identifying Subject 11 took 19 days and consumed a significant portion of the Joint Task Force's early operational bandwidth. His personal watercraft was registered to a holding company that traced through 3 layers of LLC ownership: Florida, Delaware, and the Cayman Islands. The final beneficial address resolved to a mail forwarding service in Coral Gables. The service was legitimate and had no obligation to log the identities of its users beyond a basic intake form, which had been filled in with a name that did not match any federal identity record. The cellular approach was more productive. A prepaid mobile device had been pinging towers near Davis Island's marina during each of Subject 11's documented visits. That device had made 37 calls over 6 months to a single number, a VoIP line registered through a service provider in the Netherlands, which had no obligation to retain or share subscriber information under U.S. law. The calls were brief, always under 4 minutes, always between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. On February 5th, a surveillance repositioning within the Joint Task Force, a coordination error later noted in the operational after-action review, placed one of the undercover maritime units within 40 meters of Crescent Wind during a late-night visit. The angle was better than anything captured previously. The photographs went to the FBI's facial recognition database. 72 hours of processing. Subject 11 was Ernesto Varela, 47 years old, Cuban-American, a logistics consultant based in Coral Gables with no criminal record in any U.S. system. His last documented travel was a listed business trip to Mexico City in October 2025. No direct U.S.-Cuba travel on record, but through Cancun, Mexico City, or Nassau, Cuban nationals holding dual passports had routing options that produced minimal trace in domestic immigration databases. With Varela identified, investigators had enough to expand the warrant package. They moved to execute that expansion on March 1st. 48 hours before they could do it, Subject 11 stopped appearing. February 28th, his last documented visit to Davis Island's marina. His watercraft left the bay at 1:14 a.m. It did not return. Retention Camp Point, 4 Stakes Bend. Varela's disappearance triggered an immediate internal security audit. Every communication log within the Joint Task Force was reviewed. Every analyst who had accessed the case file in the preceding 60 days was accounted for. Every subpoena request, every law enforcement database query that might have created an externally visible footprint, reviewed. The audit found nothing, but the audit took 9 days. And while investigators were examining their own operational security, Crescent Wind filed for a training cruise. Departure, March 4, 2026. Destination on file, Nassau, Bahamas. Duration, 72 hours. Passengers log, Delaney as captain, 2 documented enrolled students. Fuel load filed, 41% above the Nassau route baseline. The Joint Task Force alert reached field supervisors at 6:47 a.m. on March 4th. The operational decision came back within 90 minutes. Observe, do not interdict. The reasoning was straightforward. The case wasn't ready for aborting in prosecutorial terms. More critically, investigators believed Crescent Wind was not going to Nassau. If it was running a transfer, following it might surface the Cuban side logistics and potentially re-identify where Varela had gone. Coast Guard sector commanders signed off with reservations. They were authorizing a vessel they had reason to believe was loaded or about to be loaded, with narcotics to depart a U.S. port and enter international waters. The surveillance team made it work. Maritime tracking maintained contact on crescent wind through the Florida Straits. At approximately 8 p.m. on March 5th, the vessel altered course. Not toward Nassau, but southwest into open Gulf water. At 8:47 p.m., it dropped off AIS tracking. AIS, the Automatic Identification System, is the standard maritime transponder carried by commercially operated vessels in these waters. Disabling it in international waters is technically legal. It is also the most reliable method for hiding a vessel from standard maritime traffic monitoring systems. Coast Guard had anticipated this. The P-8 Poseidon, already airborne from NAS Jacksonville, vectored toward crescent wind's last confirmed position. The aircraft reacquired the vessel at 11:19 p.m., running without navigation lights, approximately 63 nautical miles northwest of Havana. Rendezvous position. At 11:46 p.m., aerial cameras captured a second vessel approaching from the southwest. Low profile, no lights. Fiberglass hull in a sea-match paint pattern, approximately 12 meters in length. The design was consistent with narco-submarine configurations documented in DEA Caribbean interdiction reports since 2015. Low freeboard, minimal surface signature from aerial observation, capable of carrying several hundred kilograms of compressed product at low speed across open water. The two vessels came alongside each other. Aerial cameras ran continuously for 91 minutes of transfer activity. When the semi-submersible departed, back toward Cuban waters to the southwest, crescent wind's waterline had visibly dropped. The vessel was carrying significantly more weight than when it had altered course in the Florida Straits. The Joint Task Force now had a decision. Retention point, 50% mid-roll hook. Interdict crescent wind immediately. Seize the product on the strength of the aerial transfer footage. Build the case from there. Or let the vessel return to Tampa. Follow the delivery chain to its domestic endpoint. Identify the distribution network. Find Varela. Find the architect, a name that had not yet been introduced to the investigation, but would be within days. The case for immediate interdiction came from Coast Guard. Product was moving toward a U.S. port on a vessel they had surveilled through a documented transfer. Every hour it remained at sea was an hour for something to go wrong. Weather, a secondary vessel, an unexpected route change. The case for continued surveillance came from DEA. The Marker 17 distribution network had not been mapped. The domestic endpoint for each of the 9 previous deliveries was unknown. Following the chain back might close those gaps. The debate ran across 4 hours of phone calls between field supervisors, the NCIS analytical-led DEA South Florida, and the United States Attorney's Office for the Middle District of Florida. The ASA handling the case ended the discussion, interdict on arrival. The evidentiary position on the aerial transfer was solid. The Tampa endpoint was a secondary objective, not worth the operational risk of losing product that was now documented on federal surveillance footage. Crescent wind was allowed to return unmolested. It docked at Davis Island's Marina at 2:58 a.m. on March 7. At 3:40 a.m., a secondary surveillance team at the marina observed a single individual approaching crescent wind via the dock. Not Varela. Not anyone previously photographed. Male, late 30s, dark clothing, moving with purpose. The individual was aboard for 11 minutes. Departed on foot. Surveillance teams followed him north from the marina. He entered a silver Chevrolet Tahoe with Florida plates parked 4 blocks away on Harbor Island Drive and drove north on Dale Mabry Highway. They lost him near the Interstate 275 interchange, a coverage gap in the ground surveillance grid. The silver Tahoe has not been recovered. The individual has not been identified. The product didn't move that night. Investigators determined that the March 7th visit was a delivery inspection. Confirmation that the product had arrived intact, not the collection itself. The actual offload was planned for 48 hours later. They would never see it executed, because at 6:15 a.m. on March 7th, 3 hours after Crescent Wind docked and 2 hours after the Silver Tahoe disappeared, an attorney representing Marcus Delaney called the United States Attorney's Office and requested a meeting. Marcus Delaney wanted to cooperate. The cooperation agreement was finalized over 6 weeks of negotiated sessions between Delaney's attorneys, the USA, NCIS, and DEA. What Delaney produced reshaped the investigation entirely. He had not built this operation. He had been recruited into it. In the fall of 2024, a man Delaney knew only as the architect approached Sapphire Sails, posing as a maritime consultant, interested in extended Caribbean charters. Over approximately 4 months of what appeared to be standard business conversations, meetings in coffee shops near the marina, a handful of phone calls, a formal written proposal delivered by courier, the architect laid out the arrangement in specific detail. Sapphire Sails would handle the American logistics, vessel maintenance, route filing, crew management, and the concealment infrastructure inside Crescent Wind's Keel. The school's legitimate operation would continue exactly as before. Students, classes, public reviews, marina relationships. That was a structural requirement, not an afterthought. The cover had to be real to function. In exchange, Delaney and Reinhold would receive $250,000 per successful delivery, transferred through a series of consulting invoices to a shell company the architect's associates had registered in advance. The first payment arrived in January 2025. The first transfer run followed in February. Both proceeded without incident. Over 19 months, Delaney described 7 complete deliveries, 3 partial transfers that were aborted mid-cruise due to weather events or unexpected vessel proximity alerts, Coast Guard cutters running closer than the transfer window allowed, and the 1 transfer documented by federal surveillance in March 2026. Total product moved through the pipeline, approximately 9,400 kilograms of cocaine. At DEA pricing for Marker 17 product in the Tampa Bay market, a figure derived from the prior 8 months of buy-bust operations, street-level value was estimated at $840 million. One detail from the cooperation debrief that stuck. Delaney described the architect as someone who never used the same communication channel twice after the initial in-person meetings. Every subsequent instruction arrived through a different encrypted messaging application. Every cash transfer arrived through a different intermediary. The architect met Delaney in person exactly twice, both in public spaces with multiple street exits, both for under 20 minutes, both without advance scheduling that Delaney could trace to a fixed location. Put yourself in Okafor's position for a second. An NCIS analyst who flagged the fuel anomaly in November and spent 3 weeks watching it sit in a queue. By the time the cooperation agreement was producing testimony, the operation had already run for 19 months. The gap between the first anomaly flag and the first federal arrest was roughly 7 months. Here's what that gap tells us about how these networks exploit bureaucratic latency. The structural design doesn't need to be invisible. It just needs to be visible enough to be logged but not prioritized. 41% fuel overconsumption on 9 separate filings isn't subtle. But subtle isn't the point. The point is that there are more flags than analysts to chase them. The architect was never identified. Delaney described him as a white male, mid-50s, average build, fluent English with no detectable regional or foreign accent. Physically unremarkable by deliberate design. No distinguishing features, no memorable mannerisms, no consistent clothing style across the 2 meetings. FBI composite generation and database cross-referencing produced no confident match on any element of the description. The concealment compartment inside Crescent Wind's Keel, professionally fabricated, requiring approximately 14 hours of dry dock work to install correctly, was traced to a marine fabrication shop in Sarasota. The shop had been paid in cash in full through a company called Coastal Maritime Solutions, LLC. Coastal Maritime Solutions had dissolved 11 months before the investigation began. The subcontractor who performed the fabrication, a specialist brought in for a single project by the shop's owner, who described him as a referral from a Tampa marine broker, had left Florida sometime in early 2025. His last confirmed location was Guadalajara, Mexico. He was never located. We'll say what most outlets won't. The system's failure that allowed this pipeline to run for 19 months wasn't a collection problem. NCIS collected the fuel anomaly. DEA collected the buoy coordinates. DEA collected the marker 17 signature. The failure was in the framework that was supposed to connect them. 3 separate agencies, 3 separate databases, 3 separate chains of command, and no standing mechanism for a cross-domain flag to trigger a unified operational response in under 3 weeks. The architect designed around bureaucratic latency. He didn't need the operation to be invisible. He needed it to be just visible enough to be logged, but not visible enough to be prioritized before his schedule allowed a complete delivery cycle. And for 19 months, that calculation held. Here's the take that'll probably generate some pushback. Sapphire Sails, 4 non-charged employees, the dockmaster, 2 assistant instructors, and an administrative coordinator, spent the summer of 2026 under federal non-disclosure orders, unemployed, and unable to discuss their situation publicly. None were accused of knowledge or participation. All lost their positions through forfeiture proceedings they had no legal standing to contest. That outcome deserves more scrutiny than it typically receives in coverage of federal maritime seizures. The school's fleet, 23 vessels, the majority used for routine instruction by paying students with no connection to the operation. They were impounded pending forfeiture proceedings that, based on comparable federal cases in Florida, were likely to take between 18 and 36 months to resolve. What do you think? When federal forfeiture sweeps in assets connected to an operation that most of the people who touched them knew nothing about, is that proportionate enforcement or collateral damage that doesn't get counted? Comment below. We read every response. The dawn raid on Davis Island's marina came on June 5, 2026. 4:43 a.m. 22 federal agents from NCIS, DEA, and FBI executed simultaneous operations at 3 sites. The marina itself, a secondary storage facility associated with the school's maintenance operation on the north side of Davis Islands, and Carla Reinholdt's personal vehicle, which surveillance had tracked leaving her residence at 4:17 a.m. en route to what her phone records indicated was an early morning class booking. Reinholdt was stopped at the intersection of Bayshore Boulevard and Platt Street at 4:41 a.m. 2 DEA vehicles, 1 in each traffic direction, with a 3rd positioned in the crosswalk. She was detained without physical incident. Her attorney, reached by phone within minutes, advised her not to answer questions at the scene. Marcus Delaney was already in federal custody. He had self-surrendered to U.S. Marshals 6 weeks earlier, pursuant to the cooperation agreement, pending formal arraignment scheduling. At the marina, Coast Guard units sealed both exit points, north access to the bay and the south channel exit, before the first federal agent stepped onto the dock. The simultaneous seal was the critical tactical requirement. Crescent Wind had an auxiliary engine capable of making open water in under 4 minutes from the berth if given warning. It was given none. Torres, the same petty officer first class who had initially boarded the vessel during the June 5th pre-dawn intercept, led the Keel cavity inspection under NC supervision, with a federal magistrate present on the pier. The access panel opened in under 4 minutes. 1,412 kilograms, packaged in compressed bricks wrapped in industrial-grade heat-seal plastic, stacked with mechanical precision against the interior hull structure. 43 GPS waypoints. 2 satellite phones, both wiped. $37,000 in U.S. currency. And the second set of fabrication blueprints. Different vessel dimensions, different compartment configuration, planning documentation for a second staging platform. The total cocaine seizure represented the largest Keel compartment maritime interception recorded in Florida since 2019. At the shoreside office, DEA executed a simultaneous document search warrant. 14 months of route filings, fuel purchase records, and internal communications between Delaney and Reinholdt were seized and logged. The communications documented operational awareness of the transfer schedule on Reinholdt's part, well beyond what a mechanically compliant instructor would need to know, prosecutors later argued. The school's 4 non-charged employees arrived at the marina for work at 7:15 a.m. Federal agents met them at the gate. Sapphire Sails Academy was under federal seizure. The employees were advised that they would be contacted for investigative interviews and that they were not permitted to discuss the situation publicly pending DOJ guidance. They went home. Retention caught point. Last 60s payoff plus open loop. Sentencing hearings for Delaney and Reinhold were scheduled for September 2026 in federal court in Tampa, Middle District. Delaney's cooperation agreement set a sentencing range of 7 to 12 years, with the lower end conditioned on the assessed quality of his ongoing assistance. As of the date of indictment, prosecutors assessed his cooperation as substantial but incomplete. He had provided logistics histories, route procedures, compartment specifications, partial financial routing documentation, and detailed operational timelines covering the full 19 months. What he had not produced, and what prosecutors indicated, was the primary outstanding requirement was anything that allowed investigators to identify or locate the architect. Without the architect, the cooperation credit was limited. With him, it could be more. Reinhold's defense built on functional subordination. Her attorneys argued she was an employee. She maintained the vessel, followed instructions, and operated without full knowledge of what was being moved or by whom. The wiretap recordings told a different story. Prosecutors submitted recordings from the March surveillance period captured after the expanded warrant package was approved following Delaney's cooperation, in which Reinhold was documented discussing delivery windows and product weight estimates in terms that reflected direct operational knowledge, not incidental awareness. She was charged with conspiracy to distribute a controlled substance and conspiracy to import a controlled substance. Each count carried a maximum of life imprisonment. Ernesto Varela, Subject 11, was indicted in absentia on identical charges. As of June 2026, he had not been located. Passport records and airport CCTV footage placed him departing Miami International Airport for Cancun, Mexico on February 27, 2026. One day before his last scheduled appearance at Davis Islands Marina, and one day before he stopped showing up entirely. The timing of his departure was precise. 1 day's lead, no more. The source of whatever warning he received has not been determined. The silver Chevrolet Tahoe, the vehicle that left Davis Islands Marina with the unidentified individual at 3:51 a.m. on March 7th, has not been recovered. License plate records traced it to a rental agreement under a name that did not match any federal identity database. The rental company it was contracted through filed its own suspicious activity report with FinCEN 6 weeks after the arrest. The Holguín Agricultural Cooperative, identified by the GPS waypoints, was communicated to Cuban security services through a diplomatic channel that prosecutors described on record as delicate. No Cuban nationals were charged. No arrests on the Cuban side were reported. The second set of fabrication blueprints for the unidentified second vessel is in federal evidence storage. NCIS and FBI are working the second vessel angle as a parallel investigation. As of June 2026, no vessel matching the blueprint specifications has been identified in Florida maritime records. Subscribe now. This case is still developing. The architect's search, the Varela fugitive trace, the second vessel, and the September sentencing hearings. We follow these cases through verdict. The Crescent Wind has been seized by federal authorities. Sapphire Sails Academy's operating licenses were revoked on June 9th. Its fleet, 23 vessels, most used by paying students who knew nothing of what was happening inside its flagship, sat impounded at Davis Islands Marina through the summer of 2026. The customers of Sapphire Sails, the insurance company employees, the snowbirds from Ohio, the corporate teams who logged their Bahamas certification hours aboard the school's vessels, will never know how close they came to serving as structural cover for an active narcotics transfer operation. In this kind of network, legitimate clients aren't incidental. They're load-bearing. They make the cover credible enough to survive routine inspection. The pipeline that ran through Davis Islands Marina for 19 months has been shut down. The demand that funded it still exists. The infrastructure that supplied it still exists in Cuba. The man who designed the American end of it has not been identified, has not been charged, and as of June 2026, has not been located. He knows what was built. He knows it worked. He knows the second set of blueprints is in federal evidence. The investigation continues.